Welcome, everybody. My name is Sacha Bacho, and we're excited to be hosting a great conversation on being your best advocate. Jordan, did you want to go ahead and kick things off for Sim?
Yeah, so my name is Jordan Sange. I'm the program director at Portland chapter SIM. So thank you for attending this afternoon's session. This is number 2 of 3 sessions for women in IT in Portland. So Sacha is going to be moderating this afternoon. And just let everyone know that at the end of the session, there will be a survey that will be sent out. So if you spend a couple of minutes filling it out, that will be very appreciated. So go ahead, Sacha.
Thanks, Jordan. As Jordan mentioned, we kicked off a lunch series, really, and the purpose of this lunch series is to try and find a way to continue the conversation around diversity and inclusion, specifically related to women. And one of the topics that came up regularly was being your best advocate. So please know that this is a casual, kind of informal environment. We've got 2 great panelists for you today. We're excited for them to share their journey and their stories, but we do have the chat open. So if you have a question, please put it in the chat and we will make sure to address that as we go along. On that note, hold on, here we go. So here are the lovely panelists that we have today. Tiffany, Volker, and Erin McEwen. So Tiffany comes to us with 20 years in the healthcare industry, and I'm actually going to read some of this because I won't get it right otherwise, and she certainly justifies this. She basically currently is leading the business management and engagement teams for Kaiser Permanente care and delivery technology services. And our team is responsible for running the IT as a business, which includes business operations, strategic goals, initiatives, and employee engagement. She's had an unconventional journey to getting to this seat. And so that's why we think her story is perfect for you. Because of that journey, she really strives to advocate for others. And so we're grateful for her time today. And one of the comments that was on her references that I think is important, it was from a CTO, Robert Woods, who said, this is just a little capture from that, excellent business partner who can balance the seriousness of the work with a dose of fun. So we're excited to have Tiffany join us today. Erin McEwen, who is the CEO of EasyNet, is also joining us, and she has about 15 years in the technology business around sales, partnerships, and leadership roles. She founded a tech startup called EasyNet in 2018, and she basically has taken that, as she calls it, from a side hustle to a full-time job in April of 2021. Since then, she has placed in 5 pitch competitions, and at heart, she is a tech nerd, which is why I always loved working with her. I had the pleasure of working with her. She self-describes herself as always drives to find the most eloquent and efficient ways to optimize solutions and strategy, and I would agree. When not at work, Erin loves to travel, cook, and read. And the way some people describe her from her referrals is basically the rarest of rare, a combination of extreme competence, dedication, intelligence, and focus while bringing a joy to work with. So my guess is that you can all start to see a theme here. We've got 2 ladies have had quite a bit of success, but also who bring the fun into our worlds. So here's our agenda. We're going to really talk about being your best advocate. What does that look like? The challenges that women specifically face psychologically, as well as from a cultural perspective in advocating for themselves, and then discuss some ideas for change. And our hope is that you will walk away from this conversation with one takeaway at least, as well as feeling that you're not alone and that you are part of a connected network and community. So now we'll get to the heart of the content, which is really talking to these ladies, and I'm going to stop sharing. So we'll turn this over to our panelists. So Erin and Tiffany, you're going to have to come off of mute at some point here. Thank you. So I want to start the question, really the heart of this content, right, which is around advocacy. So Tiffany, if you wouldn't mind kicking it off, would you mind taking that question on? What does being an advocate mean to you?
Yeah, and thank you. I'm super excited to talk to everybody. A little nervous also, but very excited to be here. I was thinking about this a bit more, I think, since our first kind of conversation around this topic, and I brought to mind there was a meeting that I was in with a group of folks, and I had shared an idea or an opinion, and we just kind of like moved right on. Nobody was really about it, whatever. And I actually had to, everybody has like the chats on the side and the Teams chats or whatever it might be. So I actually pinged one of my male leaders and said, hey, this is actually really important, and here's why, can you help me out here? And then he spoke up and revoiced the idea and opinion, and suddenly it was like a great idea and people were all for it. And to me, that was just an interesting and kind of very specific moment of advocacy, both me advocating for support in that moment and also him taking that opportunity to speak up and support. And to me, that's what advocacy is. That's creating that space for somebody else. That's, kind of being willing to take up the charge or their cause and kind of create that space for them to be.
Thank you. And great part of your journey. Erin, do you want to go ahead and field that one for the group here? What is being an advocate to you?
For me, being an advocate, I think of it as if your best friend came to you with that same situation, what would you say to them? How would you support them? And so when you talk about being your best advocate for yourself, it's thinking about, okay, if my best friend were in this situation, what would I advise her to do? How would I support her? What would I do? And then do that for yourself. And recognize that so often the negative things we have to say are saved for ourselves and not for others in our life.
So kind of the continuation on which Tiffany briefly touched on, can you give us a time where you realized how important advocating for yourself was?
Oh, a number of times. I mean, here's the thing. If you don't advocate for yourself, unfortunately, it's not always going to happen that somebody does it for you. So, one specific example would be when I was approached to lead a team at a former employer. And at the time, having been a sole contributor, I was able to take my daughter to school every day. And that was an important part of my life. And so I said, look, I'm interested in this role, but only if I can continue to take my daughter to school every day. And the hiring manager is like, no, that's not on the table. And I said, well, then no, that maybe the role isn't right for me. And that was me advocating for myself and thinking about, if someone else was advising me, what would they tell me to do? And 2 days later, he came back and said, well, if you could take her to school every day, would you do the job? And ultimately made the accommodations so that I was able to do what I was passionate, the important piece for me in my life, and then also take on the new role.
That's great. Thanks for that example. Tiffany,
Yeah.
kind of on that note, I mean, you did share an instance for us, but can you, Erin took that and did a nice lead in for me, which is, can you think back to that time or another time where you would, what advice would you give yourself looking back in time around an opportunity to advocate?
Yeah, that's a good one. And I love that example, Erin. I think if I were to give myself advice kind of in those moments when I look back, it's knowing those things about yourself, not just what you value. In that case, Erin, for you, it was that work-life balance, but then also knowing your value. So both what you value and knowing your own value. And I think sometimes we don't sit down to think about our own value in terms of value add, business outcomes, those kind of things. We know we're doing good work. We believe in that. And sometimes it just feels like, a weird sort of brag. And I think stepping away from that and really being able to tell that story. So, like you said, Erin, if you don't tell your story, somebody else is going to tell it for you. In some cases, it's not going to be right. So I think that would be the advice to myself, is knowing my value, crafting that kind of story, that value message, and being able to share that.
Can you maybe elaborate a little bit, because you had mentioned kind of in an unconventional path, right, to the seat that you're at? Is there a time you could think back, and I, as you know, go a little bit off script sometimes, right? But
Okay.
can you think back, right? Because you talk about that unconventional path, right, where you might have, if you could go back 10 years, giving yourself some advice or encouragement,
yeah.
and maybe an example of that where you let an opportunity pass by. and why?
Well, so I'll share this story. I think it makes me laugh now, but it was definitely not funny in the moment. I worked for a different individual who, having a degree, having the, that type of credential, I think was incredibly important. And my bit of unconventional path is that I don't have a degree. I am a lifelong learner. I definitely believe in higher education and believe in continuous learning. And so I've always, strove for that. It just, for my case, it didn't end up in the culmination of a degree. And this particular individual would dismiss my ideas, would, look to others for ideas and opinions. And so I was finding myself kind of, set aside in this space of being dismissed. And so I decided to advocate for myself a little unconventionally also, and take out all of those certificates and additional learning items. And I actually framed them and put them up on this shelf in my office. So every time he walked by, he had to be confronted by that information. And he would just stop after a while and he'd kind of sit back and he'd be like, "You're really smart, aren't you?" And then he would just continue walking by. And I swear, like, it was the weirdest thing, but for whatever reason, he needed that. And that was kind of my way of unconventionally advocating for myself in that moment. Funny now, it cracks me up to even think about doing that. I still have my box of, framed certifications. I no longer have to put those up, thank goodness. But
I think, though, that you bring up a really good point, which is oftentimes we think it's a conversation, but sometimes it's a visual indicator. And I would encourage folks to think about that, because many times in my experience, people haven't taken the time to understand your history and what you've accomplished as you move through an organization. And so really, sometimes it's those visual indicators that will prompt the conversation, right? Or the ask of you, or just reinforces without you having to say anything about what you've achieved.
Yeah, I think tailoring that too, also to who it is you're trying to tell that story to, understanding who's going to be kind of best driven by data, who's going to be best driven by, storytelling or emotive interactions, those kind of things, I think become pretty important to think about.
Yep, agreed. So Erin, I'm going to switch the conversation back over to you and ask you really, what was the biggest hurdle that you had to overcome? Though I don't think it was big, having worked with you in the past, but what was the biggest hurdle from your perspective and really overcoming the thought around advocating for yourself?
And I think that ties to, like, what would you tell yourself when you're younger, which is really more around advocating for yourself is not you can't wait until there's a trigger to advocate for yourself. And I think part of that is making that easier, because I feel like you really have to psych yourself up for a conversation with your boss about, oh, I want a raise, or I want a promotion, or, some of these like bigger conversations, as opposed to having advocating for yourself kind of just be in the flow of your daily life. And pointing out, and Tiffany did a great job kind of talking about, standing up for herself and making sure that her voice was heard, right? That's a big one. But then also, someone gives you kudos, take that opportunity, ask them to write you a LinkedIn recommendation, do sort of that like little advocating for yourself in your daily life. And then it doesn't seem like as big of a hurdle, because I to your point, I don't know that I really have had to overcome that sense of self-doubt. Of course, we all have it, right? We all have that imposter syndrome, but I think that taking the small steps on the regular makes it that much easier to kind of build that muscle of advocating for yourself, so that it's not as big of a hurdle. Does that make sense?
It does. And unfortunately, I have an unfair advantage, Tiffany, with Erin, because I worked with her for so long. So one of the things that I think that she's excellent at is exactly this particular conversation. But Erin, I think there's more intention and planning than what you're giving yourself credit for right now. So maybe you can talk about some of the tactics or ways that you insert Because I know that there's some intentionality in how you go about this.
Well, I think that if you've kind of done your homework as a woman in the business community, you understand that it can be tougher for us as women to feel like we're tooting our own horn or promoting ourselves in the same way. And so, for me, one of the things that I've always focused on is at the end of every year, if you do annual goal setting every year, then it forces you to look back at the previous year at the end of each year and recognize, okay, what did I actually accomplish of my goal list? Before you start setting your goals for the next year. And a lot of times that's really reinforcing for me. It's like the things that, I said in January, and then I frankly didn't necessarily think about strongly for, for the rest of that 12 months. You look back and you're like, oh, I actually did do da, 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 right? And it allows you to be more intentional in the conversations that you have and be able to recognize yourself and the things that you've done.
That's great. Tiffany, how about you? Do you have any comments related to either one of the largest hurdles that you had in overcoming, advocacy for yourself, and or how you accomplish that in a day-to-day routine, or just whatever that routine looks like for you?
Sure. I think one of the biggest hurdles for me was definitely rooted in that kind of sense of self-confidence. I do and definitely tied back to, not having a degree, but that's not the only thing. I mean, I think that there's just that self-critic is very strong. And so it's something that for myself personally, I've had to really kind of work through. It's so funny because my kids, when they were younger, now they're more grown. But when they were little and they'd come back from the daycare, the babysitter, they would always say, yep, you get what you get and you don't throw a fit. And I know it's just a silly saying, but I think I kind of internalize that and take that into the workplace of not asking for a raise, not asking for, a particular stretch project that I'm really interested in. And so I think that was a hurdle to kind of overcome. And it's not that you just immediately just decide, I'm going to be more confident today. It's that you practice tactically through those feelings of kind of self-criticism or lack of confidence. And, your voice might shake when you're talking about what, asking for a raise, but you still have the conversation. Or as those individual moments come up, like Erin was talking about, somebody asks you how you're doing. It's an opportunity to speak up about more than just, the weather or your day is good or that kind of thing. Hey, I'm really excited about this thing that I got an opportunity to work on. And, it's not bragging, it's sharing that kind of value story in these little moments that do truly add up. And then I think when it comes to, practical things that you can do to practice that, I had somebody recommend once to do a personal SWOT analysis, the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats about myself in the workplace. And I hadn't thought about doing that before. I mean, it seems like duh, but it was actually a really good exercise. And so periodically I like to do that and kind of check in. And like Erin is saying, keeping track of those things that you accomplish, having that kind of quick list of things, but even whether it's quarterly, end of the year, whatever it might be, those are really practical things that I think are good to do and also do contribute to your self-confidence. Being able to kind of self-reflect and say, hey, these are the strengths I'm seeing in myself, as well as opportunities. But I think it kind of feeds into that and you start to kind of build that.
That's great.
Another one that's taken me a long time to learn is actually asking for help can create self-advocacy. And I know that sounds kind of backwards, but when you ask someone for help, first of all, you've kind of made yourself vulnerable. Most people are willing to help. And then, at least from my experience, if you then follow through on taking advantage of their help and actually, making yourself better in some way, and then you circle back to that person, you're like, hey, thank you so much for that. This is what I did with it. That person now is your advocate in so many ways. And I think that out of anything, that's something that I wish I would have learned earlier in my life. was just, it's okay to ask for help, and it can actually create advocacy in your life.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. Like when it comes to feedback, I think that one of the most missed opportunities when you're asking and seeking for feedback is we just leave it open, which is good too. Like I come to you, Erin, and say like, hey, any feedback? We've worked together for the last year. Do you have any feedback for me? I love feedback. It's a gift. And you're sharing. But sometimes people, though they're working with you, they're not necessarily spending that kind of mental space to observe everything you're doing, and go figure. But so being able to come to you and say like, hey, Erin, I'm really going to work on, I did my personal SWOT, and I want to work on, speaking up in this situation. Can you help be my, accountability partner and keep an eye out for it? And then, maybe we can debrief and talk. That's a way to create a specific opportunity for growth, and kind of it does exactly what you're talking about, kind of builds that cycle of advocacy.
I think that's a great point. So what I've learned over time also is if you make it, especially to the end of today's world, right, there's so many competing agendas, women are balancing a lot of different things. And to be more specific in your ask, I've also seen people say, hey, I'm kind of doing my own annual check-in, would you mind giving me the 3 things that you think I do well, and the 3 things that you think are areas for me to work on, right? Something like that is very specific and makes it easier and gives them direction to where they can provide feedback in 5 or 10 minutes, which I think everyone's willing to do. I think it's really difficult when they actually have to think too much. I hate to say that, but like I said, we're in a world of competing agendas and priorities. And so I think that's just one of the realities of our time, which is great. Well, I know we want to spend a little bit of time, so I'm going to transition because we only have, I think, about 13 minutes left. So I want to transition into the topic related to kind of the social cost of asking. Some of you may or may not be familiar with that topic, but there is, especially for women, a consideration that when they do make asks, right, the timing of that. And Erin, you had brought up a good component to that, which is not just the social cost of asking, but sometimes when you're making asks, right, you're basically withdrawing on your political capital. So could you, the two of you, and maybe I'll start with Tiffany, maybe share an experience, right, where you were concerned about the social cost of asking, or where you felt like you had to make a political withdrawal, and what did that look like for you?
Sure. I don't know that I have a specific story for this one, but the way that I think about it is, I don't know if you guys I'm one of 6 kids, and so we always played games growing up. And one of the games we would play is this little ice cube game. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's all these little square ice cubes that are packed, kind of pressure fit into this frame, and there would be this precarious little figurine on the top. And the game was, you had to tap out these little ice cubes, and the person who made the figurine fall over, loses. And when I think about, your kind of social cost, your political cost, whatever that is, that capital, are all these little ice cubes in the frame, pressure fit together. And sometimes you knock 3 or 4 out at a time, and you're hoping that you're the little figurine and you don't fall over. So I kind of think about it in terms of that, of just anything when it comes to sort of that relational equity element of it, you have to be both, as you're taking those withdrawals out, you have to also be reinvesting those, and whether that's advocating for others, whether that's, offering something in return, it kind of builds on that. But Erin, I don't know if you have a specific example you'd like to share.
For me, I guess it would be, I'm painfully aware, just because of the way our society is, right? Men are typically promoted based on potential, and women are promoted based on past performance. So I always feel like, okay, I have to kind of, to your point, right, have your ice cubes in the tray before you're like, hey, I want this. So for me, when I went to ask for a raise, at one of my roles, I remember I actually set the stage a few months ahead of time. I was like, hey, this is what my team is doing. This is what we're going to accomplish by the end of the year. When we accomplish that, I'm going to be asking you for a raise. And so then it didn't come as a surprise. And I felt better with that whole like social piece and the political capital piece. But then I also got my raise. So
And I think that's a great example, right, of planting a seed, letting somebody know what they can be prepared for. And it does make it more comfortable, I think, for women in general. To your point, being sensitive to how, we are measured on performance. It's just kind of a fact. So hopefully over time that changes. But it is a fact that we're dealing with today. So, being aware of what your value is. And that was part of this conversation. I can tell you, personally, it was very interesting for me prior to taking the role I'm in today. And I've shared this story a couple of times, but I'm just going to interject because I think it's relevant here. What was interesting for me is I was talking to 3 different companies, and it was the first time that I literally had, was thinking about, right, what am I going to ask for? And what was interesting for me is as I was going through that decision process, probably the best advisor I had was my husband. And I literally had to practice with him around reviewing my value before I started these negotiations between these 3 organizations. And it did help me that I had 3 parties interested, right? Because you could kind of use that as a validation exercise related to what your worth was. But it was still I was still thinking about, well, what if I asked for too much? I had to do all those talk tracks in my head and remove those barriers to get to that place. And I'm thinking, wow, I've been doing this for 30 years, negotiations, very easy for me to negotiate for people around me, very difficult still for me to negotiate for myself. So, and it was a lot about, what am I willing to give up, right? What are the impressions I'm leaving with these people, those types of things. When I think of the social cost of asking, for me, it's, what power have I given up? And I don't think I think that is more of a deterrent than one we may recognize consciously. Any other comments on that topic or questions? It looks like we have some chats going on. Pradeep, do we have any questions on the topics that we had?
No, but Eileen identified the game. It was the don't break the ice game.
Awesome. So moving on, which we've been dancing around this topic around informal negotiations, right? Erin, you've alluded to that. How do you find those opportunities? How do you recognize those opportunities? Can either of you share a time or an example of a place? I mean, we've kind of shared a few of those, but anything additional to add on that topic?
One for me would be, so at a prior role, I was managing a team and we were really successful. And I heard that the new sales leadership that had come in, right, was planning to break up all the teams and mix them all around. And while that wasn't certainly a stated opportunity for negotiation, I decided that it was one, and put together an entire business case but ahead of my first meeting with the new sales leadership to explain why they shouldn't break up my team and why I was willing to accept a higher quota to keep my team together. And so I walked into our first, essentially like a meet and greet meeting, prepared with my printed out like business plan to negotiate to keep my team together. And it was probably one of the best things that I could have done. Was recognizing, even though this wasn't an official negotiation, it was an opportunity to advocate and negotiate for what I wanted.
I'd even call it intercede before their plan had gotten rolled out too far.
Yeah,
right? They couldn't come back.
Well, and a lot of that, right? I mean, I feel like you have a much better chance of negotiating if you do keep your finger on the pulse of what's going on and have that sense of like, what are you hearing? What's the back channel? So
you bring up a good topic, which was not on our agenda, but I don't want to lose the opportunity just to mention this. And then Tiffany, we're going to come back to you, which is the fact that in my experience, the thing that women are better at is understanding the repercussions of decisions like that to relationships and the inefficiency when you're having to rebuild those relationships and trust with people on your team. And so, what I've noticed is, and for the men on this call, please don't take this the wrong way, but women usually are thinking very much around the EQ and impact relationship, the relationships. And that's oftentimes undervalued when we see people as a number, right? Versus understanding how they work together as a team. And I didn't want to lose that opportunity, Erin, to highlight that, because I think that is a critical area that most women as leaders are really effective at. But don't necessarily know how to advocate, right, or express that at times, or hear about where they need to intentionally intercede before something gets broken up.
And I think sometimes you have to tie it back to a hard cost, right? Because you talk about relationship impact. Well, what's the impact of losing the relationship? Does it mean that someone leaves the company and goes somewhere else? A cost of a turnover, the cost of turnover of $100,000 employee, that's a pretty significant hard cost.
1.5, right, is the standard, right. And that's not for a high performer. A high performer is 2.0. So those are very simple terms. And I would say they're conservative terms, but for folks that don't know that, that's really what it takes to replace somebody who's been in the seat, right, who's very effective in their job. And that's a great point. Tiffany, how about you? Back to kind of like the social cost of asking, or
kind of informal negotiations. So I think what you guys just talked about also is the power of networking, and may not be everybody's favorite, but I do think that's one of the best ways to kind of keep your finger on the pulse and understand what's going on. And I absolutely, definitely believe in taking those kind of sometimes intangible, soft benefits or items and tying those back to that. I think when you're talking about sharing your value story, which might be sharing your opinion, your idea, other kind of things, feeding into negotiations, tying those back to those hard costs. Sometimes hard to do, but super important. And I think you get a little bit further doing that. The other thing I was going to say is, so I had the joy of going through the Regional Leadership Forum program through SIM. Definitely recommend it if you haven't checked it out yet. That's my little plug. But one of the best pieces of advice I heard through that in one of our sessions was, when they give you options A and B, take option C. And that's so burned into my brain, because I think it's just when it comes to informal negotiations, sometimes we get stuck and it has to be like this or this. And don't be afraid to blend, to create some sort of better option and negotiate for that.
Which circles back to knowing what's important to you.
Yes.
Right, and being prepared for that. One thing I would recommend, and I know that you both probably have this, is we oftentimes have talk tracks for initiatives or our teams, but we don't necessarily have individual talk tracks. And having 3 or 4 points ready to go when an informal opportunity comes up, so that you can speak to your point, Erin, right, a value exchange, like what you have done. Don't assume people know you've accomplished for an organization, right, or what you've delivered. Real quickly, we did have actually a question from Eileen in the chat, which I'd love you both to address if we could, which is basically a lot of new managers do something like that to a certain, I think she was talking about the shifting of teams and personnel to assert their power, not to benefit the group. How do you take that on?
So speaking from personal experience, what I did is I literally built out a business plan as to why that was a bad move. I listed out what our performance had been and how low our turnover had been on the team. And then I was able to articulate, look, we're happy as a team to take on X% higher quota to keep the team together. And here's the other benefits that the company will realize by keeping our team together. And ultimately, that's what they wound up doing is, they agreed to keep my team together and I had a higher quota, but then my quota actually ramped down over 6 months and the other manager's quota ramped up over the next 6 months. And so ultimately, we all wound up with the same quota, but I was able to keep my high performing team completely together through that process.
Which is important when you're building.
Yes. Tiffany, over to you.
Yeah, how about you, Tiffany? Anything to add related to taking on that challenge?
So definitely, I've been even recently on the receiving end of some reorg changes and shifts, and you know, striving to understand really what those leaders who maybe had made that decision incoming, striving to understand the why. Sometimes the why is shared, sometimes it's not, but understanding that, I think, is really beneficial, and it puts you in an interesting place, because maybe it's not something that you particularly agree with, but you're responsible for carrying that forward, right? So then it comes down to, you know, can you advocate for your team, for what you need, your team needs, and building that trust pretty quickly. So yeah, it's kind of all tied together. I mean, in this conversation, for sure, the advocacy for yourself or for your team doesn't end. You know, whether you're on the receiving end or you're able to negotiate a different path out of that.
Yeah. So we have another question in the chat that I actually think is a really important one, from Stacy Austin. And basically she quotes the statement, men are promoted based on potential and women based upon past performance. How do we manage this? Do I need to keep vying for valuable projects that have visibility? So if she's in a project management role, what do you recommend? Or I should say she's managing a project management group of people. What would you recommend? And specifically, her manager is responsible for work assignments. So maybe start with, you know, how do we basically tie into the fact that we are measured on performance?
Great question, Stacey. You know, so being a CEO of a startup right now, you know, we've kind of dabbled a little bit in the whole fundraising path. And for those who don't know, about 2% of venture capital actually goes to female-led companies. It's an abysmally low number. And one of the reasons that they've found that it's that way is because the questions that actually get asked of you, and you can find, I think there's a great TED Talk on it that you can Google, but that men are asked sort of like expansive questions, like what's the potential of your company? And then women are asked like limiting questions, like, well, how are you going to make that happen? You know, what proof do you have that people are actually going to buy this? You know, those kinds of things. And so I'm coming back to your question, I promise. Can you shift some of the questions that your manager asks you and shift them back to the potential questions around what you can do, and really creating that expansiveness? Because that's going to be your best shot at then pushing forward on the potential rather than the past performance.
Yeah, it totally made me just think of, so I took this art class many years ago, and I always thought growing up I was okay at doing art. And I took this class and I was just terrible. It was awful. It was the first time I had taken like a art class, like a structured art class. And it was like, I could not wrap my head around why I was truly so awful at this stuff. Didn't think I was that bad, but what happened was we would be given a time frame we'd have something set in front of us. You have your easel and you're working on it. And they're like, okay, I mean, there's this intricate thing in front of you and you have 5 minutes. And I'm like thinking, okay, as like a recovering perfectionist, like, what? This is just not going to happen. But exactly to that, Erin, like what I learned through that process was it's not about recreating or answering exactly what's in front of you. That's why I think the whole, like, when there's option A and option B, go with option C, give them option C. That became so pivotal to me as like a growth opportunity that you don't have to be so black and white that like you're answering just the specific thing. Take that moment and create that space. Like, again, about advocacy for yourself. You don't have to go just where somebody has said this is your path. Like, you have that option, so take it.
And I would just, sorry, go ahead, Erin. No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, for Stacey specifically, maybe that looks like, hey, manager, I noticed that this project really aligns well with my skill set, and I think that I would do a great job taking it to, whatever potential you're wanting to push it towards. And maybe it's not one of the projects that had been identified, to Tiffany's point, right? Maybe it's option C. Sorry, Sacha, go ahead.
No, it's okay. The thing I was going to say is peel it back a little bit, Stacey, which is, if the goal here is for you to be able to get a career opportunity for growth or advancement, just have that conversation around where your strengths are from their perspective and then where the gaps are, and then tie back and figure out what you might need to do around the projects, to what Erin's saying. But I think to me, there's a larger question, which is this a step in you trying to get career advancement? And then find out from those folks that are making those decisions, right, what's important to them. And then what I am not good at, that these two talked about, is expanding, right, what the potential is versus, focusing backwards on what you have delivered. So, and there is one last question that I guess we'll try and get here, because we are actually at end of time. So if you two ladies don't mind staying on another minute, we actually had a gentleman step up. So thank you. It says, as a man, is there an appropriate way to ask for feedback on my effectiveness as an ally? Which is a fabulous question.
Tiffany, you want to take it?
Sure. Yes. I think that just like, to me, it kind of goes back to the whole like asking for feedback thing. So when you're approaching that question with anybody saying, this is something that is really important to me, and it's something that I'm trying to personally work on, would you be comfortable giving me some feedback? How is this going? Are there other things that I can be doing differently or, better, or stop doing? I think that's a fantastic question. And it doesn't, it's not just the gender question too. It's any sort of group where you're passionate about trying to better yourself and becoming an ally. I think that's absolutely a fantastic question to be asking.
Yeah, and thank you for asking it. And I think that also finding out for the people, for the women, but really anyone, to Tiffany's point, it's not gender specific. What are their ultimate goals? And then what are some ways that you can informally, right, or formally, depending on the setting, advocate for them and help them get where they're trying to go? Because that's truly the best way that you can be an ally is, amplifying the voices that don't get heard, particularly, but also when someone isn't even in the room, right, helping be their ally and support them.
Yeah. So I would just add, and Erin, you teed it up perfectly, and that really touched on it. But Stephen, the thing, first of all, the fact you're asking this question is amazing, and thank you. I don't think there is a bad way to ask for feedback in this area. Just please ask the question. But specifically, I think the area that I see the most, and I find myself, even after years of trying to insert myself, creating space specifically for women, it is a gender issue for us, creating space for them to participate and making sure that the spotlight stays on their feedback is critical. So if you're looking to maybe take a step further, ask if you have a team, or if you have people that are your partners in work, ask them if you're creating space for them, right? So that they feel like their opinions or their feedback is getting visibility. I personally think could be one of the greatest things that you could do. So on that note, we are over time. Real quickly, I shared this earlier, but we'll see if I can actually get it to share again. We do have a number of other events coming up for STEM. This is a monthly, third Wednesday of every month. We'll have our next session is going to basically be the Women's Lunch Series. Will be on recruiting and building your network, because that's a big conversation that needs to happen. We also have, and that's August 18th, we also have a SIM social that will be happening that same evening for those of you that are local. And then there's a national webinar, which I thought was a great topic, coming up next week on July 28th, which you do not need to be a member to join, called Belonging, which I think is a big issue for women. The speaker is going to be the author of Provoking Greatness and Unleashing Hidden Talent. I think the most important thing here is hopefully you realize you're not alone in this journey. You have a lot of support, and both Erin and Tiffany are on LinkedIn, and I have no doubt that they would be happy to connect with you. So thank you, Tiffany and Erin, for sharing your stories, being vulnerable, and some great tidbits and advice. We're very, very grateful that you joined us today. And until next month, hopefully we'll see everyone else there. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.